So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ian Fairlie. Ian is an independent consultant on radiation in the environment, and he's been a consultant to the UK government, being scientific secretary to the government's committee examining radiation risks of internal emitters. Ian, over to you.
There are a lot of problems with nuclear power in terms of radiation and radioactivity. It's my area of expertise, and that's why I'm choosing to speak on this issue. There's two kinds of things. One is that, as we all know, there's a possibility of cataclysmic accidents. Both we have examples of that at Fukushima and at Chernobyl. I'm going to be showing slides of this if we ever get them going. But in the meantime, during breaks and for tea and for coffee and stuff like that, on the walls here, to my right, and also behind, are the fallout patterns for both Fukushima and from Chernobyl. The reason why I'm pointing these out is because not many people know these. They've not really been publicized at all by official agencies, and certainly not by the BBC or any of the newspapers. But if you look, you'll see that Britain really got it from Chernobyl. I have no I'm not at all happy to say that, but just in case, the reason I'm mentioning this is because some scientists actually have said on the television and BBC, Gerald and Thomas, for example, that the Chernobyl plumes never reached Britain. If only. Okay, first slide, please. I started off by saying to you that there are really serious radiation problems from the catastrophic effects which may occur. This is Chernobyl in 1986, and this is where it used to be. And you can see what happened was that it exploded and resulted in the turbine hall being severely contaminated. Go on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Right. This resulted in this, no, previous slide. This is Chernobyl here, and it resulted in this contamination throughout the whole of Europe. 65% of the land area of Europe was contaminated to above a level of 40 kilobecquerels per square kilometer. And as you can see, the west coast of Scotland got it, basically following rainfall. The worst area, ironically, was round about Sellafield, which was poetic justice in a way. But the main countries that got it, obviously, were Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Next slide. This is the UK. I put it up there so that if there's any journalists here, they can see from the horse's mouth, so to speak, that the contamination levels in the west coast were really very high. Indeed, contamination levels were so high that there were food bans on upland sheep farms in North Wales and in Cumbria right up to 2012. The next slide. In March the 14th, 2011, we had 4 explosions I'm not going to go to them all, they're quite similar to each other in many ways. This is Unit 3. Next slide. This is the damage to Unit 4 and Unit 3. All of this has all been covered up, of course, by now. But there were explosions as well in the tank at Unit 4 and Unit 2 as well, and Unit 1. All 4 had explosions. So you often read in newspapers, they say a triple meltdown. Yeah, there was 3 meltdowns, but there was 4 explosions, which is even more frightening. Go on, next slide. This is the contamination from Fukushima in Japan, familiar horseshoe-shaped. About 8% of the land area of Japan was severely contaminated, 8%. And there's a lot of denial about that, but this is, for a small country like Japan, it had a devastating effect, still has. Next slide. Now, I'm going to be talking not about accidents, about routine emissions, particularly to air, although you have routine discharges to water. One of the take-home messages I would like you to use is that air emissions are about a factor of 20, maybe 50 times more dangerous, more serious in terms of their effects than discharges to water, okay? Remember that figure, 50 times more dangerous. But most people only think about discharges to water, but it's discharges to air that are really important. Now, I went through Google Pictures to try and find some pictures of discharges from nuclear power stations. And you know, there are hardly any at all. This one is back from the end of the 60s, showing what happens when you open up a reactor to refuel. You get this monster plume. Now, the reason why you can see it is because the temperature was about 2 degrees C, and the water droplets froze, so you saw this, what you call steam, but in fact is water vapor, radioactive water vapor. Next slide. This is a rather rare picture of Sizewell. This here is the radioactive plume coming out during reprocessing. Ignore the other ones. And the next slide. And here, not this one here, but these here at Dungeness B, this is radioactive water vapor, which comes out all the time. You don't see it most of the time. It has to be cold, so you see the condensation. Next slide. Now, what happens with these plumes that I've mentioned to you? Well, very rarely is there sort of a graphic illustration of this. But this is one. This is from I pinched it from an IAEA seminar that I was at. This is the power station here, and they did a test of releasing 1 terabec of tritium over a period of an hour. And this is the resulting plume that you get. And these are the doses below the plume. You can see that, generally speaking, the closer you are, the worse. And this is doses of organically bound tritium in cow's milk. Now, these are not my data. This is their data, okay? But how often does this get across to the public about the serious effect of aerial emissions? And it doesn't get across. Next slide. Right. The most important is that there are effects, and those are childhood leukemias of kids under 5 within 5 kilometers of the power station. The most powerful study, and the one that's been totally ignored in Britain so far, is the KICK study. KICK stands for Kinderkrebs in der Umgebung den Kernkraftwerken. You got that? Yeah? Good. It's going to be a test at the end. And these are the studies. The reason I put them down is because these slides will be available, and people can pick them up and they can get the actual studies. A very large study, the German government found 120% increases in childhood leukemias and 60% in solid cancers. Now this stunned the German intelligentsia and the German scientists. They were absolutely gobsmacked because this study was commissioned by the German government to prove the exact opposite, that there was nothing to worry about. And instead, they found this, and it was very strongly linked to proximity to nuclear power stations. Okay, next slide. And many of, if they had actually looked at this, they would have seen that there are many other studies which have exactly similar findings. Down here, 60 studies, 60 studies worldwide of leukemias near nuclear power stations. Now, many of these only show tiny increases, some don't even show an increase at all. But the vast preponderance, over 45, do show increases. Okay, next slide. This is interesting, that Germany, Britain, Switzerland, and France, they all, as a result of the KICK study, they all did cover-up studies immediately afterwards to say, well, we don't have increased leukemias near us. Well, of course, here they are. 41, 30, 40, 37% increases in childhood leukemias. Now, all of them, every single one of the governments said, oh, but it's not statistically significant, which is a sort of a cover-up trick to make sure that findings that they don't like can be discredited. What they should have done is they should have added them all up. And this is what myself and Alfred Corbeline did, added up the figures so you get big numbers, and yes, willy-nilly there is a 37% increase, which is statistically significant. And for those people who are, this is the p-value here, 0.004, in other words, very statistically significant. Next slide. I published a report, a hypothesis to explain why there were such large increases in childhood leukemia. This was published in 2014, in fact. The 13 was the IT version. This study has been downloaded 5,832 times, I'm very pleased to say. It's true that I don't get any royalties from it, but otherwise I'd be a very rich man. But I'm very pleased that this has had a real impact in the nuclear world. Next slide. And my hypothesis very quickly is that there are big episodic increases, big spikes of radionuclides during refueling. Something like about 70 to 75% of the annual emissions all come out at once within a couple of hours. And here's an example. This is a smoking gun. This shows why there are such big increases. It was really difficult to get this data, very, very difficult. In the bar and the restaurant, I'll tell you the funny story of how we managed to get this from Germany. But this is, if you can see this sort of thick line down at the bottom, that's 3 becquerels per cubic meter. That's what it's like for 99% of the time, right? You have these small emissions here coming out. And then all of a sudden, they start opening up the reactors and you get this big spike. This figure here is 1,500, which is 500 times larger than the 3 at the bottom here. And in this spike here, about 3/4, 70% of the annual emissions occur. Here. And this is, as I say, the smoking gun. Shows you why we get these whopping increases. Okay, I'll see if it can work. Hey, works great. So what is tritium? It's the radioactive isotope of hydrogen. We all know hydrogen as being one of the 2 atoms on water connected to oxygen. And in fact, the most common form that we see in the environment is radioactive water vapor, or radioactive water. Now, this isn't something, if you had a glass of tritiated water here in my hand, it's not something in the water, it's the water itself, which is radioactive. That makes a big difference. Why? Because we are water. 66% of us, we're water bags. 60% by weight is water. And to me, when I first started studying this, I realized this is really important. How can we be putting this vast amounts of radioactive water in the atmosphere, which we breathe in, or the people living nearby breathe in, and absorbed through the skin, we drink it in radioactive water, contaminated water supplies, and also eat it as organically bound tritium. To me, this is a public scandal. And because it's slightly complicated, it's very difficult to get the message across. But scientists are picking it up. As I say, there's over 5,000, almost 6,000 downloads. Okay, I'm going to finish off soon. Essentially, and this is something that I feel dear about, that nuclear offends against our principles, because we should have principles in this area. There is a moral dimension to what's happening. I insist that there is. And we as morally sentient people need to take this into account, I believe. And the government certainly doesn't. And nuclear power offends against the precautionary principle, the sustainability principle, and the fairness principle. Just very quickly, the precautionary principle is that, well, we should be issuing health warnings near nuclear power stations. This was, say, a lead factory or a cadmium. Was that 1 minute? 2 minutes. If this was any other kind of factory, there would be issuing health warnings. We'd be looking to close them down. We should be issuing, we should warn residents when the spikes are going to occur. In other words, when they're going to open up a reactor, we should be telling the residents so that women who are of childbearing age or women who know they're pregnant should leave during that time. We should, thank you. We should be issuing stable iodine tablets which prevent the uptake of radioactive iodine to everybody at least within 30 kilometers of the power stations, right? We should be doing evacuation drills of everybody within 30 kilometers. Now, a number of people smile and say, but Ian, that's crazy. If it's crazy, we shouldn't be operating the reactors. That's my view. And we should seriously consider closing our very old reactors. All of them are past their sell-by dates. All of them have got problems attached to them with graphite cracking. And basically, what's happening right now with our existing reactors is we're crossing our fingers and hoping nothing will go wrong. Well, that's not good enough. These are nuclear reactors we're playing with, baby. We should be really setting up a program for phasing out the reactors. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Ian. So I turn to our next speaker, Dr. David Toke. David is Reader in Energy Politics at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Aberdeen. He was an early mover in pressing for a non-nuclear response to climate change in his book Green Energy, and it was his work which paved the way for feed-in tariffs in 2008. Welcome, David.